In 1931, director and star Charlie Chaplin gave the world a dynamic comedy that pulls not a single punch.
In 2023, we hang out in Kentucky to try a different kind of whiskey.
The film is City Lights.
The whiskey is Town Branch Rye.
And we'll review them both. This is
the Film and Whiskey Podcast. Welcome to the Film and Whiskey Podcast, where each week we review a classic movie and a glass of whiskey. I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And this week we are looking at our first silent film in the history of the Film and Whiskey Podcast.
Shum-ba-da-bum.
I am so excited, Brad. I've been waiting for this moment for many seasons.
See, and that's the thing, man. When you get your excitement up, your hopes up, everything in my soul just wants to crush it.
I can tell. Yeah. I already know that you're coming in here just ready to test all of my patience today, Brad, because we're looking at our first silent film, and it is perhaps the highest regarded American silent film from that entire era. We're talking about Charlie Chaplin's 1931 film, City Lights. Brad, this is a movie that is ranked, I believe, now inside the top 10 on the American Film Institute's updated top 100 list. It's a movie that appears on the BFI Sight and Sound poll. Brad, this is a juggernaut of silent cinema from a guy that I think most people know. If you haven't actually watched Charlie Chaplin, they know him from just being like the silly guy with the funny mustache. And here he is being a silly guy with a funny mustache, and people are saying it's one of the greatest films of all time.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say the other day you sent me his Oscar. What was it, kind of like an honorary lifetime Oscar that they gave him?
Yep.
And I don't say that to disqualify it. He is one of the greatest filmmakers of all time. And his speech, if you could call it that, was utterly heartwarming and touching.
But the movie itself, Brad, where are we standing on that? That's the question.
That's what we're here to answer. And I think that you were hedging your bets. You knew my darker impulses. And so you brought... Bob, you consider yourself the expert here. But if you know about 5% of film, you brought in somebody who probably knows 99% of silent film.
Honestly, and I don't mean this to make anybody blush here, but we're going to introduce our guest. It is the film critic Marya Gates. And she is she's got to be among the world's preeminent silent film scholars. We literally were just talking to her before we press record about the movies that she watched last year and logged on Letterboxd, and she said that on average she logs about 800 movies a year on Letterboxd. So she's seeing quite a few more movies than I am. And Brad, if anyone is going to be able to stand in my corner like Charlie Chaplin in this boxing scene in this movie, it's Marya. So Marya, thank you for being here today. How are you?
Is Marya going to be the referee standing between us?
I could be that. It's great to be here. Yeah, it's great to be here. I love talking about silent movies. Anytime someone's interested, I'm like, I have things to say. So maybe too many things to say.
Well, let me ask this. I think this is like a good introductory question because, our podcast is built around the premise that a lot of the movies that we're watching are being introduced to Brad for the first time. As someone who has seen as many silents as you have, we talk all the time about the fact that 90% of silent films have been lost to time and deterioration. But even among the 10% that survive, I feel like we really only talk about a small handful of them. And, it's for good reason. These are great, great movies that are still mimicked and parodied and lifted from today. Does it ever get old to you to talk about the same 5 silent films all the time?
No, I do like it when I am with my people and I can talk about a deeper cut film. I could talk about John H. Collins or, some of these directors that he died in the 1919 Spanish influenza. So not a lot of people have seen his films. But the fact that there are some silent films that normal people will watch is, and not to put all silent film fans under the category of abnormal, but I think you have to be a little abnormal to watch as many as some of us do, is a testament to what you said, that some of these films truly are transcendent. I love all of the silent era. It's about 40 years worth of cinema, and it's, as I think I was saying earlier, before everyone was listening, that it's a specific mode of art. It's a different type of art. Within those 40 years, there's different modes of storytelling. And that's why each decade practically, and sometimes every 5 years, you have different ways of making a film. Mm-hmm. The fact that some of those films are still watched today, and you can put Chaplin in front of children and they see the magic, or you can put, one of my favorite screenings ever was the Mark of Zorro with Douglas Fairbanks. I watched that with a bunch of 8-year-olds, I think, in San Francisco, maybe 10 years ago. And they were cheering just as if he was Batman or something. Yeah. So the fact that some of these movies are so timeless, that children can watch them, or, at whatever age you are, you can come to it. It's 100 years old. This one's not quite 100 years old, but it's getting there. And people love it the same exact way, I think is a testament to the height of this artistry for some of these films.
Yeah, it honestly is an interesting illustration of a question I've always had, which is like, music has been around for forever, but from a certain era, we only really remember Beethoven, Bach, like these big names. And I'm always curious, like, when you think about music from the 1960s, like, how long will the Beatles last? And like,
I feel like there's already young people who don't like them. Yeah,
right.
Yeah, but like 150 years from now, like, how many of their songs will people remember? Is it just going to be one or two? And it's interesting to look back on film, because I think you have that question kind of being answered, because we're getting to the point where these films are 100 years old, and what lasts. And like you said, I'm looking at City Lights here. There's 188,000 rankings on IMDb for this movie. So it's not like it's a not well seen film.
Yeah, exactly. Brad, if I can wax poetic here for a minute, one of the things I love about silent film, and I have obviously not seen nearly as many as our guest today, but it is timeless, and it is so accessible to everybody from young to old. And this was the thing about Chaplin, was it spanned ages, it spanned classes. It was an iconic character that transcended all of the societal divisions in America. And the movies themselves, even today, I like to put my children down in front of the TV and have them watch quiet TV, because there's a lot of loud children's programming now. And so like I try to do Mr. Rogers with them, and that worked like gangbusters for a couple years until they figured out what I was doing when I put Mr. Rogers on. And then I was like, you know what? I'm going to try some Chaplin. I'm going to try some Buster Keaton. My son, my 6-year-old, has watched the clip. There's a specific clip from Modern Times, which we're going to watch in a couple weeks here, Brad, of Chaplin being strapped into this newfangled feeding machine. And it is, it's hilarious. I laugh out loud every time. I have never seen my son laugh as hard as he laughs at that clip every single time we play it. And we just started watching Buster Keaton. He has a short called 1 Week that is just absolutely hilarious. And it's so cool to see that without words and just with a little bit of reading comprehension, this kid is locked into these movies in a way that he's not with super bombastic, sensory overload kind of children's programming that you get elsewhere today. Anyway, that's my plug for sticking your kids in front of silent films.
Yeah, no, that's the reality. While I didn't grow up with silent films, I did grow up with like things like the Three Stooges. And so there's something about the physicality that children are drawn to. I don't think there's anything wrong with saying, hey, like, put your kids down, have them watch Three Stooges, have them watch Charlie Chaplin, because they have such an engaging manner of visualization that it entertained me for hours and hours and hours, and I know it would any other kid.
Listen, like, people falling over and poop jokes are universal, and they last forever. And this movie has both of those things. So we're going to get into talking about them. Brad, we will set the stage for this movie and the context into which it was released in just a minute. But before we get there, It is time for America's favorite segment, which we call Brad Explains.
Brad's gonna give us the movie plot with only 60 seconds ticking on the clock. So let's go ahead and hear your take with this little segment that we call Brad Explains.
Brad Explains is the part of the podcast where Brad breaks down the plot of the movie that he has just seen, often for the first time. Brad, I assume this was your first time seeing City Lights.
Absolutely, it was.
This is your first silent movie ever, right?
Yes.
Okay.
I think I've said before, I've seen clips here and there. I know I've seen the clip you were referring to from Modern Times.
Okay.
So it's, but this is the first time I sat down and just watched it start to finish.
I was thinking that it would be difficult to do an episode on silent film. And so seasons and seasons ago, I started planning ahead for this. We used to splice in clips, audio clips of the movies into our episodes. And I was like, one day we will do Chaplin and I will have nothing to splice. And so we kind of stopped doing that. But the more I think about it, there really is no difference in describing the plot of the movie, the mechanics of the movie here. So you've had 7 years of practice leading up to this point, Brad. I'm going to give you 60 seconds on the clock to break down the plot of this movie, and go.
City Lights is a film about a tramp in what I would assume to be New York City, a New York City lookalike at the very least, who falls in love with a blind flower girl and is trying to do his best to win her love. He runs into his title is The Erratic Millionaire, who tries to kill himself because his wife has left him. Chaplin saves his life, and they become best drunken friends until he's not drunk anymore, and then he doesn't like him and doesn't remember him, but then he gets drunk again, and they hang out, but then he's not drunk, and they stop hanging out. But Chaplin, the tramp, finds a way to get into a boxing match in order to win money, and he is given money from the millionaire to be able to help heal his blind
5 seconds
friend.
And
that's it.
Is he successful?
You'll have to watch the movie and find out, Bob.
We're going to spoil everything until the last 5 minutes, and then you have to watch that for yourself.
I mean, it's only been out for 89, 90 years. So,
yeah. Marya, you have been waiting so patiently in the background here, and I appreciate you just letting us ramble. As we set the stage for this movie, can you give us just a brief overview of the history of the character of the tramp? This was Chaplin's, honestly, it was the only character he played for decades. I don't know if I can adequately explain the hold that this character had on the American culture leading up to City Lights.
Yeah. What's interesting is that Chaplin started out sort of like Keaton as a physical performer for the British version of vaudeville, and was a physical comedian his whole life. The Tramp was created on this 1914 short film, so we're over 100 years, called Mabel's Strange Predicament, starring Mabel Normand, who is one of those stars who was so famous, and now no one knows who she is except a handful of people. But Mabel Normand, everything Chaplin knew about working on screen, he learned from Mabel Normand. But essentially, he accidentally created this sort of trampy character. He showed up in a few other shorts. He was in this other Keystone film called Kid Auto Races at Venice, which sounds exactly what it is. It's a bunch of kids doing auto races in Venice. Mm-hmm. And slowly, his tramp clown character became this national and then later international phenomenon. But also aspects of the visual styling of the little tramp with the hat and the mustache came from a very famous French comedian called Max Linder, who had just come to America and sort of was starting to influence American comedy. Because actually, film comedy really came out of France. Like a lot of things in cinema, France was really the first international comedians, superstar comedians, mostly were coming out of France. So you have Max Linder, you have Mabel Normand, now you have the Tramp. Charlie Chaplin usurps them all. Chaplin obviously is more remembered. You can get Blu-rays of Chaplin's movies. You cannot get Blu-rays of Max Linder. Although I think some of Mabel Normand's films are now on Blu-ray sets. So there's at least that. But obviously he was this probably, I think, still the most famous face of the silent era. You come kind of close with Buster Keaton. And then you have the three American comedians everyone remembers, which is also Harold Lloyd.
Mm-hmm.
Those three guys are sort of who you remember now, but they all sort of came out of this earlier history of silent comedy that also came out of vaudeville. Like almost everyone came out of vaudeville. So by the time this film came out in 1931, Chaplin had been the superstar for 15 years or more. But also silent cinema had gone away. It was the Jazz Singers 1927. By 1928, you started to have more and more very primitive, I would say, sound films. They're a little creaky. They're trying things. And some of the greatest silent films, truly, it was an art that was like ascendant. And then sound came in and it went like in the gutter again. And I don't know if it'll ever get back to 1928, frankly, but that's another podcast. So Chaplin was in the middle of developing this when sound came in, and he was like, I don't care. And I'm very popular, so I'm going to do this movie, and people are still going to watch it. And people did watch it. And so in 1931, you were seeing like pre-code, gangster films. You had pretty much it'd be like the equivalent of, we're in the Marvel films now, right? It'd be the equivalent of like a Terrence Malick, like spiritual movie in the forest being the #1 box office film.
Right.
Like,
Right.
can you imagine that? But he was so popular that people were like, Cagney can wait, or I gotta see Chaplin. And he 5 years later made Modern Times, which I think you said you're going to be watching, also a silent film. But I do think his greatest work is these silent films, and that's partially because his face is so expressive, which I'm sure you noticed while watching this film. Not something we can put on a podcast. I don't think we can put the essence of his eyes in a sound, which is sort of the hard thing about writing and talking about silent film. And what I always find the most difficult is that there's something ineffable about the magic that comes off in a silent film. And there's that quote in Sunset Boulevard, "We had faces then." And I do think that there is something about
There's
the faces.
some truth to that, yeah.
There really is something about the faces that made it into Hollywood, and the expressive eyes and the kind of talent that directors and camera people found and were looking for that brought something that isn't necessarily there for once you have sound. There's some actors who I think are still a little ineffable, but it's never been the same.
Well, I mean, Bob and I were talking about it before we got on here. The final scene of the film, like Charlie is acting his heart out, and it's incredible. And like the close-up on his face.
He said the reason it's so good is he's A, not acting, and B, he underplayed it. And you watch that and you're like, what? This is him underplaying it? Holy shit.
It's incredible.
We will get into talking about Chaplin, the actor, too, but I think that scene is a really great key into talking about Chaplin, the filmmaker here, Brad, because this movie uses close-ups very sparingly. Like, most of this movie is done either in wide shots so you can see his whole body, or in like a two-shot. I'm thinking specifically of like the scene where he's getting ready to go box, and he's sitting across the table from the guy that he's going to box with, and they have them both framed in the shot. But the reason that ending works so well is you don't see that face in close-up, in that extreme of a close-up until the very end of the movie. And it's so effective because Chaplin knows how to play a shot where the camera is 15 feet away versus how to play a shot where the camera is 6 inches from his face, And honestly, Brad, like I'm so excited to dive into talking about the filmmaking behind this movie. So Chaplin transitions from making shorts to making feature-length films in 1921 when the movie The Kid comes out. So he's been doing it for a decade now, and audiences have come to expect that a Chaplin film is going to be a big event. They're really expensive movies, and they make a killing at the box office. He comes out with a movie in the late 20s called The Circus, and The Circus is a great movie that has kind of like, I don't want to say it's like fallen by the wayside, because it's really, really revered. But it's kind of like when we talk about Hitchcock, Brad, and how you and I have reviewed now like the 4 biggest Hitchcock movies. and then everybody kind of has like their fifth favorite Hitchcock movie. It's kind of like that with The Circus. It was a movie that Chaplin had a ton of personal outside stuff affecting, and it was really, really a hard period of his life. And the movie was successful, but it wasn't as successful as he wanted it to be. He doesn't win any Oscars for it, except they give him an honorary Oscar, which made him feel like even more embarrassed and insulted by it because the movie wasn't really good enough in their eyes to win competitive Oscars. And so that's when The Jazz Singer gets released, and the world is going crazy for talkies. And perhaps stubbornly, perhaps because he really did think this movie would work better as a silent, he decided to plow ahead with this movie as a silent. But he figured out that there were elements of the new sound that you could have basically imprinted onto the film that really worked in his favor. For the first time, he could put a score to the movie, and it would be the same score in the exact same spot at the exact same tempo as he's always wanted it to be. And so the music is part of the movie. And then he also does this thing where he's really ragging on the crappy sound quality of early talkies, because I just imagine a crowded theater, the lights go down, this movie starts, and this is an audience that's been used to like craning their necks to try to figure out what people are saying on this horribly recorded, contraption for the last 3 years that we've had talkies. And the first thing you hear is Chaplin making fun of that, because it fades up on this scene of a mayor dedicating a statue. And instead of a voice coming out of his mouth, it's Chaplin playing a kazoo and just going. And it is like, it's such a mean joke, but it is so silly and it's so funny. And it perfectly sets the stage for what's going to happen in the movie.
Yeah, I when rewatching it this week, I forgot how funny that sound cue is, because it's sort of like the Peanuts.
Yes.
When the adults speak, it's like that.
Yep.
And it's funny because it's this in joke about sound, but it's also sort of similar to all of his running, not hatred, but running ragging of organized,
authority figures.
Authority, yeah. He's always trying to find ways to cause chaos, and he just starts this movie straight up being like, this mayor is full of crap, so we don't even need to listen. And I love that he doesn't give him an intertitle either, so you don't know what
he's supposed to be saying.
It's fine, we don't need the speech.
Yeah, and the best thing is, as with any great comedian, the inside joke works. Like, everybody who was there in the time understood what he was trying to say. But it still is funny if you have no idea the joke he's trying to make about, talkies at the time. Like, here we are, 90 years later, and it's still just funny to hear. Mm-hmm. Like, it still is something that's amusing. I think it's stuff like that makes him stand out to me, that it doesn't just work as an inside joke. It also works as just a funny gag, audio gag in the film.
Brad, it's hard to talk about performances when we think about this movie, because it's like so dominated by Chaplin's character. And we will obviously be talking about Chaplin's performance throughout this episode. But where would you like to start in terms of like other players in the cast that you really liked their performance?
Honestly, I really liked the butler. Mm-hmm. And I really liked the other fighter who he was fighting against. Yeah. Like, I think we'll get to Virginia Cheryl and Harry Myers, who play the millionaire and the blind girl. But if we're just going to give a quick shout out to anybody else, I really enjoyed the butler, who, engages in some of the physical comedy with Chaplin, as well as he seems to be titled a prize fighter.
So both of those actors are actually people that Chaplin had worked with a ton in the past, and they were kind of like part of his company. And the guy that plays the butler, we'll actually see him again in modern times in like a really small role when we watch that movie. But yeah, man, I'm totally with you. They're both just like the great thing about a Chaplin movie is, and this is kind of like the terror of working with Chaplin from all those stories that I've read. He was such a micromanager. The little boy that is blowing like spit wads at him at the end of the movie, he gave an interview years and years later where he talked about how on set, Chaplin would basically be saying, okay, here's how you blow like a spit wad at me. And then he would go mimic that and then run over here and mimic him reacting to it. And then he would mimic what the other little boy is supposed to be doing. And then he would tell every extra in the background exactly what they're supposed to be doing. And it's such a choreographed, symphony kind of a thing. But it also makes for every tiny performance in the movie being pitch perfect. Like I was laughing my ass off at the moment where Chaplin, driving a Rolls Royce, dressed to the nines, pretending he's rich, but needing a cigar, sees one sitting on the ground, pulls his Rolls Royce over and just knocks a hobo over so that he could pick up the cigar for himself. And then the reaction shot of the homeless guy is like, it's pitch perfect, dude.
Yeah, dude, there's just so many little gags throughout the film that I don't even think that directors would understand how to keep things moving the way Chaplin does here. Like, he just keeps things moving, and there's so many little things kind of happening on the side that, honestly, I want to go back and watch this again because I know for a fact that I missed a lot. And I'm like, I need to come back to this. Mm-hmm. And here's the beautiful thing, Bob. Under 90 minutes.
An 82-minute movie, as God intended. Am I right?
Yeah, it's one of the best things about Chaplin is that he's such a visual storyteller that there are always like multiple gags going at once. Even in some of the scenes that are really heartfelt, there's often something else if you're looking there. Mm-hmm. Like he understood that every part of the frame should have some sort of information, should make you think of something.
One of the things I love is how intuitively he uses the camera. And so there's a very famous story, Brad, that I will now introduce you to about how he and the co-star of this movie, Virginia Cherrill, did not like each other at all. They did not get along. She actually got fired for a period of time and then rehired by Chaplin when he basically figured out he had shot too much to replace her. So he just had to bring her back. But the scene that he could not crack for months and months and months of the shooting schedule was their introduction to each other. How are we going to convey that she mistakes him for being a rich man visually? Because obviously you can't do it, through dialogue, and she's blind. So there has to be something that she encounters, that she hears, that would cue into her that he was a rich person and start this whole kind of comedy of errors. And it didn't occur to him until way later in the schedule, the idea of a slamming car door that a rich guy is getting into, and she thinks that it's him. But leading up to that moment, Brad, Chaplin had done 342 takes of this scene and was trying to work it out as they were acting it out. And that's kind of what drove Virginia Cherrill crazy about it, was because she could tell that he didn't really have it figured out, and he just was waiting for the inspiration to come by making them continue to perform it until something happened.
He did more takes on that than we have done episodes of this podcast. But like far and away more, like 150 more takes.
Yeah.
I was going to say, when they talk about filmmakers like Fincher or Kubrick who did lots and lots of takes, Chaplin is absolutely on that list. I think this is the record for his in terms of how much footage he shot. Because he made the film over 2 years. And not normally when you hear like, oh, it took 2 years to make this movie, like normally that's because, like Claudia Wheel's Girlfriends or something, where she was shooting it on a Saturday once a week, when she had the money kind of thing. Like it was not common for a movie, unless it was like von Stroheim's Greed. It was not common for a movie to take that long to make. And, in the teens when he was starting out, those filmmakers that were making the two-reelers, they were making one of those a week. It was like making a TV episode. He shot over 300,000 feet of film for this movie. Mm-hmm. This is the equivalent of like not to bring Malick up again, when Malick made The Thin Red Line and he shot so much footage, there was supposedly an 8-hour assembly cut of that film before they whittled it down to what we ended up seeing. That's why like half the cast for The Thin Red Line is not in the movie. But eventually from the 300,000 feet of film, the 89-minute film is 8,000, just 8,100 feet. So like that's
crazy.
A lot of film that didn't end up on the cutting room floor. And it's like with digital, you can just keep shooting. With film, you have to keep buying more film. You have to,
Oh, so I was going to say, one of the things I love about him as a director, though, is that he so clearly understands how to move the camera. And that scene in particular is such a very simple pan. Like it is like the two of them standing against this gate. And then when she hears the car door slamming, the camera very quickly, it's like almost like a whip pan. It pans right over to what she's hearing and then very slowly pans back over again as Chaplin sneaks away. And one of the things that the great silent directors did so well was to know how to choreograph the action and how to consider the camera as like another member of that kind of dance, I guess. I remember talking to you about the movie RRR last year and how everybody freaked out about the choreography to that song Not To, and the very famous clip that's been gifted to death now of just them like fixed in the center of the frame as it kind of tracks to the right, and they just follow it as they're dancing like as hard as they can. And I remember, making a post about this and saying, like, this is what American directors of modern musicals are not remembering anymore, is that the most compelling camera move in the musical is just to put your subject in the dead center of the screen and then either track or pan along with them, because bodies in motion are compelling in themselves. Like, you don't have to make the most complex camera move to go along with it. And I think Chaplin understood that better than almost any director, because he knew what he was capable of and he knew what he could choreograph in front of the camera. And so the camera moves are never superfluous. You know what I mean? It's just exactly what needs to be done. And if it tracks a little bit, if it wheels around the boxing ring a little bit, it's just because that's what's needed for that shot. And then everything you see is creating enough movement to accentuate that.
Yeah, and he said that he thought of himself as a dancer always. And I think you see that in the way he performs as the tramp, but also you see it, like you said, in the fluid camera movements. And I think some of the reasons he had issues with some of his leading ladies, he did not repeat leading ladies that often, was he didn't always cast somebody who thought of themselves as a dancer, who thought like a dancer, who understood that way of making a film. Whereas like some of the actors, like you mentioned the boxer, he was a Keystone Cop. They'd known each other, going back since the beginning of each of their careers. And the Keystone Cops, while, very funny, were sort of more similar to dancers than any other kind of comedy, because that running, chasing athleticism that they did and the tumbling and the falling is sort of a mixture of dance and acrobatics, really. And I think you see the more successful co-stars for Chaplin are ones who came out of that earlier era of filmmaking because they understood that way of filmmaking, as opposed to the sort of matinee idol drama style actresses who aren't quite as used to thinking about their bodies that way.
Right,
yeah.
exactly.
And what's interesting about this coming in 1931 is that you stopped seeing that kind of fluid camera movement, but in the late 1900s, like from 1925 to 1928, those silent era films tend to be the ones people watch the most, I think, because they have that beautiful camera movement, and they've gotten to a point where they've been doing it for 30 years and they understand how to choreograph big scopes or to move the camera in such a way that you feel like you're immersed in the film. But in 1931, most films weren't doing that. They had the creaky sound. They had more stationary camera shots again, because you had to worry about where's the microphone, right? And you do see some filmmakers making pre-codes that have a little more finesse to them, and they tend to be, again, the filmmakers who started out as silent film directors in the teens, and so they've been doing it for so long that just adding a microphone didn't, salt their game too much. But but the bulk of what you saw in the early 1930s is the camera movements just gets really stationary, and so you have a movie like this come out, and people are so used to, not this anymore. Like they've gotten used to the new normal, and suddenly they're reminded of what film could be. And I do think that's part of why this has a legacy to it in a way that few films from this year do.
That's such a good point. I didn't think about that. I mean, it's kind of the opposite of what I was saying, because I'm like, oh, Chaplin's not moving the camera in these really intricate oneers like Spielberg would, and that's just because the camera's huge and bulky at that point. But also, what you're saying is because of the kind of restrictions that a lot of these directors were facing with the implementation of sound, they just didn't move the camera at all.
Yeah.
And so this probably looked 10 times as fluid to the normal person who is used to just seeing a stationary camera. I love that.
Yeah, it's really like pre-code's an interesting era because the stories get really racy, and costumes get really, really beautiful and scandalous. But the camera work leaves a lot to be, except for the Busby Berkeley ones, because he was a choreographer and he figured out ways. You don't need the sound to really work when you're like going underneath someone's legs, right? So he was able to do a lot of what's beautiful and known in his choreography because the sound was added later for all those dance numbers that Busby Berkeley shot. But when you're doing like a costume drama or like a Joan Crawford film or something where it's dialogue heavy, you end up having less interesting camera moves for quite a while because you would hear everything with the boom mic.
Mm-hmm.
And I think those films tend to be sometimes a little creaky, and I love them. I love the pre-code era. I pretty much love every era. It's hard for me to find an era that I don't like, but you have to kind of have more context in a way. And so it's another era that's not well remembered. I think pre-codes are starting to have a little more of a resurgence. I think Criterion Channel has done a great job of trying to get people to watch them. But again, you have a film like this, and you look at this film, and then you look at most of the other films from 1931, and you're like, maybe we should just stop having sound for a while again.
Brad, real quick, before we go to break, because we do need a break, I want to say up front, like, we've been talking about all of the incredible technical achievements of this movie and all of the historical context that it was released into. I just want to say very plainly, this is a very silly, very funny movie for most of its runtime. It's super profound and heart-wrenching at the end, but like, this is a hilarious comedy. And
I was going to say, the boxing scene, the physicality of that scene reminded me of watching Looney Tunes growing up.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
You know what I mean? Like, it feels like something where you have Bugs Bunny being chased by the hunter, whatever his name is, Elmer Fudd.
Elmer Fudd, yeah.
Like, it feels like that, but it's live action, and it's hilarious, and there's so many visual gags in that scene that, Bob, I am with you. This is just a fun movie that just so happens to be technically brilliant.
Yeah. Well, and that's another thing, like, talking about that boxing scene. I think that people who have never seen a Chaplin movie, they have an idea of Chaplin as like this funny pratfall guy. He's a guy that's going to get knocked over or do something silly with his body. But what I love is like when you actually watch the gags, not only are the gags incredibly intricate with their physicality, but they also have so much like character motivation behind them. And he does a great job of setting up the gag. There's like 10 minutes of buildup to the actual fight. Mm-hmm. And Chaplin gets roped into fighting so he can win money for this blind girl, and the guy that he's going to fight is going to split the money with him 50-50 because he just wants a quick buck. But then that guy gets a telegram and says, get out of town, the cops are after you. So they pull another guy off the street, and he's big and lumbering, and he's just going to beat the hell out of Charlie Chaplin. And so then you get this great sequence where Chaplin's trying to like flatter him and like be real chummy with him so he won't get beat up. And then when they finally get into the ring, Chaplin's taking every opportunity to take cheap shots at this guy so that he can knock him out because he's scared. And when the guy finally starts to get woozy, you get that great little beat of Chaplin like pushing down on his shoulders to try to get him to fall quicker. It's just like, I think the thing that people don't realize if you've never watched one of these movies is that it's not just a guy falling over for a gag. It is like, it's incredibly well thought out. And we'll get around to this when we do our Let's Make It a Double, but I think that the influence of Chaplin's comic timing and the way these gags are set up are still being mimicked to this day in cinema, Brad.
Yeah. No, I'm with you, man. I think that it's almost like when you see a brilliant stand-up comedian, the way that they intro with a joke, and then 3 or 4 times throughout the set, they refer back to that joke, right? And they just weave it into their other jokes, and there's a brilliance to it. And you see that with Chaplin here, that he sets the stage, and then he uses that stage throughout the rest of the film, building on itself to build better and better jokes.
Mm-hmm. Well, Brad, I like to think that our podcast builds to better and better moments. So,
like when we invite people like Marya on.
Exactly. Let's hit pause here. Let's go try this Town Branch Rye, and then we'll come back and finish talking about City Lights. What do you say?
Let's get to it.
All right, so today we are checking out Town Branch Rye. Brad, Town Branch is a distillery in Lexington, Kentucky that is near and dear to my heart because it is the first distillery I ever took a tour of on the Kentucky Bourbon Trail.
Hey.
When I first moved to the Lexington area, my wife and I went to Alltech, which is the giant conglomerate that owns Lexington Distilling Company. They also...
Fun fact,
go ahead.
They make Kentucky Bourbon Barrel Ale.
That's right.
Which is incredible.
They also have a brewery on site. And so when you go on the tour, you check in, you pay your $10 or whatever it is, and they give you a little cup full of tokens. And the cool thing about this distillery tour is that you can cash in the tokens to try samples of whatever you want along the way. So you could spend your 4 or 5 tokens on 4 or 5 beers to try. You could spend them on all the spirits they make, or you could mix and match. So it's a really, really fun and super customizable tour. That was actually the first tour I took my parents on, too, and they came to visit when we lived in Kentucky. I just think it's a really fun entry point. Like, if you're not all consumed by being a bourbon bro and you just want to kind of dabble in the world of bourbon, it's a really good starter level distillery tour. So, Town Branch Rye. Here's the thing, Brad. I don't know what to do with this because the bottle that I have sitting in front of me right now has been discontinued. I don't know if you will remember. I'll send you a picture of what the bottle used to look like. They have since rebranded, and they've kind of relaunched Town Branch as a brand in these nifty looking square bottles. The thing about the old Town Branch Rye is that I can't actually tell if everything in this bottle was distilled on Alltech's campus in Lexington. And this is just a little insight into the jargon that they put on labels. When you flip a bottle over and on the back of it, it says something like, this whiskey was made in Indiana or something, but bottled by Jack and Jill's distillery in Bardstown, Kentucky. Like, they didn't make it. They got it from Indiana. One really confusing word that they use sometimes is produced by, because what does that even mean? Like, there's no regulation behind produced by. It doesn't say distilled by. So I have no idea because it says produced by Alltech's Lexington Distilling Company in Lexington, Kentucky. I don't know if that means they distilled all this or not.
By produced, you mean like pulled it out of a hat like a magician. I produced this.
I know that their more recent label says that it was all distilled on site. So this may be a combination of stuff they distilled and then they blended with older stock that they sourced from somewhere else. Here's the other thing about it. When I tried to look this up online, even though they make a lot of whiskey and they're a fairly sizable player in the industry now, there's not a lot of information about this whiskey online. I know that some of our more learned friends probably know the ins and outs of Alltech. So like Zach Johnston, hit me up after this episode and let me know what was going on with the old label Town Branch. But for now, Brad, I'm just going to assume this was all made at the distillery in Lexington.
All I hear you saying is, welcome to Film and Whiskey, where everything's made up and the points don't matter.
This is why whiskey scares people off, Brad. Like, people who aren't in the world of whiskey, all this jargon, all this, like, does any of this matter? At the end of the day, does the whiskey taste good or not? And that's what we're here to figure out. This is a 100 proof rye whiskey. It does not say that it is straight rye whiskey, which is what the new label says. So I have no idea how freaking old this is either. So I'm going to assume it's at least 4 years old because there's no age statement on the bottle. Let's give it a try, Brad. What are you picking up on the nose?
The nose here has some vanilla, some clove, some rye coming through, and then almost like a spiced cherry. And it's kind of unique and interesting. I'm intrigued by it. I will give it a 7.5 out of 10.
I am not ashamed to admit that drinking rye is always a humbling experience for me, Brad, because I like to think that with as many whiskeys as we've tried, I have a fairly discerning palate now. But there's something about the rye grain that I can never pick up as many things on the nose as you can with rye. Like, I just can't. I smell rye. It smells like a rye. It doesn't smell like a minty rye. I think in my mind, I have two categories of rye, and it's like minty rye and dill rye. And this is more dill rye for me, which I'm cool with.
Peated scotch and non-peated scotch.
Exactly. I like it a lot. I actually, if I'm going to drink rye, I want it to taste like rye. Like, I want it to go all the way. And this one really has a strong rye grain with that almost kind of sour dill presence to it. A little bit of sweetness kind of undergirding it. I like it a lot. I'm going to give it a 7.5 on the nose.
Yeah, and when I got into the palate, there's some really nice complexity here that isn't overwhelming. I think that there's a little bit of a citrus flavor in the middle of my palate. There was some honey on the tip of my tongue. And then there was just this really nice feeling of like a fresh, spongy spice cake that wasn't as sweet as it was kind of savory. And then at the back end, I finished after drinking it for a little bit and felt like, there's just some really nice vanilla here. So 8 out of 10 on the palate for me.
I do not like this. This, sometimes like you can just kind of tell that something's not working for you. It doesn't mean it's not good, but like it just doesn't work for you. For me, the way this manifested was like really young rye grain. And then it tipped into like super bitter grapefruit. Like not sour, but really, really bitter. And then the bitterness kind of fed back into the youthfulness of it. And it's like this self-perpetuating cycle. And by the time I swallowed, I was like, oh man, I don't like this at all. It started off okay. It was like one of those experiences where you're like, like the more I drank, it was just, it kept getting worse and worse for me. This is a 4.5 out of 10 on the palate for me.
4.5?
Yeah, man, this is,
wow.
And like the longer I sit here with this aftertaste, it is not doing it for me, man.
Man, well, I'm just gonna finish out my finish and balance scores. 7.5 on the finish. There's some oak, some vanilla, some rye. Nothing too crazy, but nothing bad. Nothing sour, or bitter, or gross or anything. Anybody who tells you otherwise is crazy. 7 out of 10 on the balance. Decently complex. Has some good flavors, but nothing that makes it stand out.
I'm on sip number 3. And it is approaching palatability at this point. But yeah, man, this is like the closest thing that I don't know what I could compare it to. It's like if a whiskey could get skunked, this is like what it's doing in my mouth. Does that make sense? Like, I know you're not having the same experience, but I'm trying to parse out what part of this is just like a really herbal experience versus youthfulness on the grain versus something really off in how bitter it is. And it's just not working for me, man. I'm going to give it, a 5 out of 10 on the finish. It's a little bit better than the palate was for me, but I'm like slightly worried that something is off with my bottle. And therefore the balance is way out of whack on this bad boy. It started off okay, and it slowly tipped into fearing for my safety. So I am going to give it a 5.5 on the balance.
Man. Yeah, so the value here, Bob, I'm seeing this bottle at $49. Is that what you're having at?
Yeah, Brad, that looks about right. Now, again, this bottle that we're drinking out of has been discontinued, which is really hard. It's hard to review a product that they may or may not have completely overhauled at this point. And I would be more than happy to come back around to this someday and try the new Town Branch Rye, if in fact it is new and not just the same whiskey with a new label on it. So Let's be very clear here. Old Town Branch Rye, I don't know how much it would cost you to find a bottle of it. I would not advise you seeking this out by any means, but we're going to score it as if it is priced at the new Town Branch Rye price. And at that price, Brad, I cannot advise against this strongly enough. This is the most visceral reaction to a whiskey on a regular episode that we've done in a long, long time for me.
Yeah. Well, what's your score for a $50 bottle then?
I trust your palate enough to think that maybe I'm just reacting weird to this and that it's not just like a horrible product. But I trust my palate enough to know that I would never spend money on this. So I'm going to give it a 3 out of 10 on value.
Yeah, I actually gave it a 5 out of 10. I don't think this is a great value. I think that overall it's a decent product that should be about $10 to $15 cheaper. Like if this was a $30 to $35 bottle, I'd say, yep, this is really solid value. But at $50, I don't know. It's just not quite as worth it for me. I'm coming to a 35.5 out of 50, Bob. Where are you at in the teens?
I am coming out to a 25.5 out of 50.
Woo!
So that's bringing us to an average of a 30.5 or a 61 out of 100. I absolutely and unequivocally do not recommend trying or buying this. However, I will say I absolutely recommend going on the All-Tech tour. Like I'm shocked at how I don't remember this being this bad, which is making me wonder if they did in fact just overhaul the entire, product itself.
Yeah, maybe they did. And like you said, we are both big fans of Alltech. They make great beer. They make good whiskey. So go check them out if you are in Lexington. I think I would, it doesn't matter if I recommend this, Bob. You can't get it anymore. So go drink Kentucky Bourbon Barrel Ale. It's delicious.
It's real good. It's my wife's favorite beer.
That's my recommendation for the day. Get it on tap if you can. That I will say, like in the bottle, it's like a solid 7.5 beer, but getting it on tap is like a 9.5 out of 10 experience.
Mm-hmm. All right, man. That was a letdown, but what's not a letdown is talking to our new friend Marya Gates about silent movies. So what do you say we get back into talking about City Lights?
Let's get to it. All right, everybody. That was Town Branch Rye, a whiskey that might be one of the most simply named whiskeys we've drank in a long time, Bob.
They really have been a mouthful lately. It's nice to just say Town Branch Rye and be done with it.
That's it.
Well, Brad, it is time for us to get into our next segment of the day, Canada's favorite segment, which we call Two Facts and a Falsehood.
Brad is gonna try to stump you, Bob, to our right and what is wrong. Two facts and a falsehood.
Two Facts and a Falsehood is the part of the podcast where Brad presents 3 items to me as fact about the making of this movie, one of which is a complete fabrication that Brad has made up, and it's my job to figure out which one is the lie. Brad, I believe I am sitting at 500 on the year right now. I had a comeback victory last week. Oh, no, I didn't. I had a defeat last week.
You definitely had a defeat last week.
I had a
defeat. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Vince, for that one. Vince Mancini did not help me out on that one at all. So I think you're right. I might be 1 under 500, which puts the pressure on Marya to help me with this 2 facts and a falsehood. Brad, I am a little comforted by the fact that you don't know anything about silent movies.
Yeah, I feel zero confidence. I almost wanted to call a truce for the next 4 or 5 weeks, however long we're doing Chaplin.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm going to soldier on ahead and see if I can catch you. I'll be honest, if I can catch you this week, I think I should just win for the season.
All right.
With Marya helping you, I don't doubt that you will get this one.
Well, I am not sweating over here, so hit me with your 2 facts and a falsehood.
All right. Fact number 1, one of Sir Charles Chaplin's friends, the famous illustrator Ralph Barton, was on set one day during the filming of the scene where Charlie and the blind girl meet. His home movies, which appear in Unknown Chaplin from 1983, are the only known behind-the-scenes footage of Chaplin at work in costume as the tramp. Fact number 2, the scene where Chaplin first meets the eccentric millionaire had to be reshot many, many times over due to Chaplin's insistence that Harry Myers was not, quote, falling properly, end quote, into the river. Fact number 3, Sir Charles Chaplin had invited Albert Einstein and his wife Elsa to join him at the Los Angeles premiere on January 30th, 1931. When the house lights came up, Chaplin was surprised to see Einstein's eyes were tearing over at the final scene.
I believe number 3 is a fact because I know the first part of that statement is a fact. I know he took Albert Einstein and his wife to the premiere, and I like to think that Mr. Einstein, Dr. Einstein, had a heart and was affected by the end of this movie. So I'm going to say 3 is true. 1 and 2 both sound plausible, but I might have to phone a friend here. Marya, are you gravitating towards either of these as the falsehood?
I feel like there's more behind the scenes. That's what's catching me up there, because I know that documentary, but I feel like there's more behind the scenes than just the one movie.
Yeah, the in costume is what's throwing me off here.
Yeah.
Like maybe he wasn't. And you know what? I actually was just watching the Criterion Blu-ray for City Lights before we started recording, and I had just started watching that behind the scenes footage. So I know that that's a thing. I know it exists, but is it the only? I don't know.
It's definitely one of those, like, is this too much information and therefore it's wrong, or is it too much information because that's exactly the truth? I'm a terrible phone a friend here because I don't actually know.
All right. I will bite the bullet on this one. I'm going to say number 2 is the falsehood, even though it sounds very plausible. I just think that it sounds a little too simplistic. And so I'm going to say Brad wrote that one. That sounds insulting to Brad. I'm sorry. Wow. I didn't mean it like that, Brad.
That 100% sounded insulting. I will say this is the disclaimer we always let our guests know. These are true as IMDb says they're true.
Yes, these are lifted from the IMDb trivia section.
However, Bob, you are correct. Number 2 was the falsehood, written by Simpleton Brad.
I was just going to say, thank you, Mr. Simplistic. Well, I feel terrible. I didn't mean it like that at all, but it worked in my favor.
Do you feel terrible?
I do not retract that statement at all. Marya has helped me pull ahead on the season, and I can lord it over you now for at least a couple more weeks, Brad.
Yeah, you're welcome, Bob, I suppose.
All right, let's get back into talking about this movie. We have left out one huge component of the movie when it comes to actress Virginia Cherrill. We haven't talked about her performance. This is by far the performance that she is best remembered for. I think I said in the first half that they did not really get along at all. I don't think you can really tell. This is a pretty exceptional pairing on screen. And, you know, I don't want to say their chemistry is palpable. It kind of is. But I think their commitment to their characters and the way that they dramatically portray each of their respective states, you know what I mean? Him being down on his luck, her having a disability. Brad, there's a great story of Chaplin hiring her because he noticed that she was very nearsighted. And so her way of kind of looking, like physically looking at her surroundings, made her the only actress that Chaplin screen tested that could play blind without being offensive. That was his quote about it. So
that's impressive.
I think she's great in this movie, man.
Yeah, I think that she has an incredible softness to her that counteracts the physicality of Chaplin's, you know, gesticulating and just the way he commands the screen. There's a gentleness to her that draws you in and makes sense to why the tramp would fall in love with her. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Oh, 100%. Marya, like when you think about all of, and you were mentioning this in the first half, like all of the partners that he shared the screen with over the years, where would you rank her and this pairing?
I think they are really wonderful together. I think my favorite is Paula Goddard from
Me Too.
Modern Times.
Me too.
Because she's also a clown. But in terms of what I think he wanted to achieve with this movie, I think it was perfect casting, even if she was very difficult. And she wasn't ever really intending to be an actress. She was just one of those modern women who got a divorce and moved to LA and made a go of it kind of thing. It was a very 20s thing to do. She's like of the first generation of women who really had the freedom to try to do something like that. Ended up in this movie, almost got fired for this movie, made a few other movies. They're not very many of them are very good. I like Fast Workers. It's got John Gilbert in it and Mae Clark, but Virginia Terrell is like fifth cast in it. And then really what's interesting is that she may have been a great actress in the silent era, right? Because you mentioned she has that softness and she has that sort of magical quality to her eyes that were valued in the silent era. But if you watch some of her later films, and I think Fast Workers is the only one I've seen, she's not great. She's not a great actress in terms of speaking. So
wow.
the fact
Shots
that
fired.
So the fact that she ended up in basically the last great silent film other than Modern Times, last great American silent film, is kind of almost appropriate. Like this was the end of this kind of art, and she came to Hollywood right as this part of the art was dying, and gave one of the last great silent film performances in a film that became timeless. But she's not timeless beyond it. And I think that's because the talent she had, and maybe it was like Chaplin, maybe the 3,000 or 300,000 feet is just bad footage of her. I don't know. But he was able to find that magic in her and put it in this movie. And I think it's both a testament to him as a director, editor, and her at least having that somewhere in her,
Marya,
even if that's only 1% of what was on the film.
Right.
Marya, normally Bob is the expert at giving underhanded compliments, but man, oh man, you are gunning for the crown, my friend.
I was going to say.
It's fascinating that she is so well known for this one role, and that's it. And probably more people, I would venture to say more people have seen her one great performance than probably everything that like Louise Brooks ever did. Right. And no one is looking at Virginia Terrell and Louise Brooks and saying like they're on par, or like Mabel Normand, same. Part of it's Mabel Normand's films, or a lot of them are, lost. But it's interesting and shows sort of the irony of this business, that it is, they always say like it's not just the talent you have, it's who you know. And in this case, she met Chaplin. She got in this last great Chaplin movie, this last great silent era Chaplin movie. And
she was nearsighted.
And there it is, right? Yeah.
That's what qualifies
it's that alchemy. It's that alchemy that you can't plan that.
So before we wrap up today, guys, I want to say that, Brad, we could go on and on about our favorite gags in the movie. I talked about just that little throwaway moment of him shoving over a hobo. I don't know why I laughed so hard at that moment, but it really got me. There's so many like little throwaway gags in this movie. But I think on a deeper level than that, the reason that Chaplin's movies are remembered even more than his contemporaries like Keaton or Harold Lloyd is that they are unashamedly sentimental. I mean, they just are. Like they so perfectly pair the melancholy with the comedy. And I think that is like the key to understanding Chaplin as a director. He had like a very keen sense of what the average person who was going to his movies was going through. Like this movie comes out as America is is like plunging headfirst into the Great Depression. And it's a movie about insane wealth versus insane poverty, and the tramp as kind of navigating this crazy world around him. And it's appropriate, Brad, that we just did another little mini series on Billy Wilder, because I think that we had a really great discussion about how Wilder uses suicide as like a plot device in a ton of his movies.
I've been thinking about that this whole time, where I'm like, I was completely wrong. Like Marya, for reference, I kept saying, I was like, I feel like there's nobody in Hollywood that's willing to go in the like, hey, let's talk about suicide. It'll be a fun time for everyone. And yet Billy Wilder does it. And then I come here and I watch Mr. Chaplin, Sir Chaplin, and it's like 15, 20 minutes into the movie and you got the millionaire trying to kill himself.
Mm-hmm. I mean, like, and it's not just done for laughs. Like, that is one of the funnier gags in the movie. It's also like the darkest gag in the whole movie. But I think it's really indicative of the fact that Chaplin is always willing to go there. Chaplin is willing to show, in the movie The Circus, I started watching it with my 6-year-old, and there's very funny gags. And then like the main female protagonist in that movie is getting like horrifically abused by her dad in that movie, just like getting the crap kicked out of her in
Great
multiple
6-year-old
material. Dude, I was like, all right, we're gonna press pause on The Circus and let's go do something else now. But I think again, the reason that it's so successful is that Chaplin knows when to use the dark moments of humanity to to find the humor in it, but then to also like leverage those moments into something like the ending of this movie, which we still haven't really talked about. I really want to discuss the ending of this movie.
Definitely one of those greatest endings of all time endings. You see you see that ending and you're like, why don't people not know how to end movies anymore? I literally said that out loud when I watched this a couple of days ago. It's like, people don't know how to end movies anymore. It's like, this is a perfect ending. Like, it's great.
No, 100%. The beauty of the unspoken, like, right off into the sunset. You don't know if they get together. You don't know if all these things happen, but the sentimentality of his smile, and he's still a little bit like bashful, and it just slowly fades to black and the end. Mm-hmm. And it's beautiful and it's heartwarming, and you don't expect it after all the gags that have come throughout. Like you're expecting him to fall, pratfall at the end. And yet it's utterly, and I'm going to use my favorite word, it's utterly sincere, Bob.
Brad, like we don't often make comparisons to like great works of philosophy or religion on this podcast, but listeners of this...
about to quote Gorgias.
Listeners of this podcast know, Brad and I both went to seminary, and so once in a while something sparks our interest on the theological front. And I was watching this movie and I kept thinking of this story in the New Testament where Jesus is talking about, he encounters a woman at the temple that puts her last 2 mites into the offering and talks about how she gave more than anybody else. And I think, honestly, Chaplin, not known for his religious allegories, but this is his most like nakedly religious symbolism, iconography kind of movie for me, because it is such an obvious like self-pouring out kind of thing, and it's so obviously connected to the poor and to the impoverished. And I just love the ending of this movie where you don't know if this person who is at his most destitute, he's been destitute the whole movie, but when you see him come out of jail at the end of the movie and he's just literally wearing rags that are tattered and he has no shirt on underneath his iconic jacket anymore, it's like a pitiable state. And for him to leave the character of the tramp in an even more pitiable state and asking the question of like, will he be accepted like this? And the last line of the movie to be her saying, yes, I can see now. It gives you the hope, but it never actually shows you the payoff. And I think that is exactly why it's the perfect ending for this movie. It's ambiguous, but he still won't let you leave without holding out hope that the rest of the world will be as self-sacrificial as the tramp is.
Dude. And even like that line of like, yes, I can see now, like that for me just sounds like Jesus calling out, like, he who has ears, let him hear.
Well, I think like there's a very like, again, like the way that I was reading in a book about city lights today, and the author was commenting on how there is a supernatural kind of element to this miracle cure for blindness, that this doctor is healing, the poor for free, and it's a miracle, and all you have to do is come to him. Like it is a very obvious kind of symbolism in this movie, and I don't know to what end. Like I don't really know why Chaplin is being so overt with it, But I just do love the idea of this movie coming out in the middle of the Great Depression about sympathy with and, I don't know, solidarity with the poorest of the poor and using the tramp to exemplify that.
And also kind of bashing on the millionaire a little bit. Like he loses his wife. He has thousands of dollars stolen from him. Well, not stolen. He gives it away and forgets that he gave it away.
It's a Robin Hood thing, you know.
Yeah, totally.
Marya, when you think about this movie, you know, obviously we're over here talking about theology and everything. Like, what is your big takeaway in terms of like the overarching sentiment of the movie and what it's trying to communicate at the end?
I liked your point about it having a little glimmer of hope at the end. I think a lot of Chaplin's films wrestle with melancholy and wrestle with systems that are not, for lack of a better word, fair. Even though the American dream is that everyone with a little gumption can make it, right? But that's not how the systems are actually set up. And a lot of his movies, especially his features, sort of investigate that idea. Like The Kid is all about not to spoil The Kid, but it's about poverty and about living on the street and as a child and wanting to adopt a child and the issues of like who's allowed to be a parent and who's actually got the best intention for what is a family, right? And it's a beautiful film. Jackie Coogan's fantastic in it. But it's a lot of his films look at these systems and look at how someone like the Tramp will come in and he doesn't care about the systems. And he's just kind of fumbling through. In between, he's sort of a trickster kind of. He's like the coyote god, right? And he's just sort of in between the lines, liminal space kind of person, and shows you the folly of systems and the folly of the idea that things are fair. Things were ever fair, not just in America, but like anywhere. But even though that bleak line is always there, he always ends on a place of, but maybe, right? But maybe with love, things, even as the bad system is still in place, we can find a little paradise for ourselves. And I think that's part of why his films are even more timeless than even Buster Keaton, whose films are maybe funnier. I think they're funnier, but they're definitely not as deep in terms of the emotions they try to evoke in its viewers.
Well, and you know, if this all isn't your cup of tea, dear listener, there is a joke about an elephant pooping in this movie. So like you get the best of both worlds.
Which I have to say, I don't know if you saw Babylon. I loved Babylon. The fact that people were upset about that, and I was like, okay, but do you love City Lights? Like, all of this, I'm like, it's there. So when I was rewatching this, I was like,
it's a reference.
Damien Chazelle knew what he was doing. I love that movie. That movie's really smart, and I feel like a lot of people who know just enough to not know everything he's doing thinks that it's not as smart as it is, but it's a very smart movie. And the main thing that every silent comedian knows is, to your point, people falling down and poop jokes are funny. And barf jokes, like
clearly
all of that.
Timeless.
It's funny.
Yeah.
It's funny in Babylon. It's funny in the sound joke in Babylon, where it's like, who's gonna want sound? And then the guy like shits in the stall. That's so funny. I watched that movie 3 times. I laughed every time.
That's a great
timeless joke. And so the thing that's great about Chaplin is he does both those things. He has this very big raw heart, and then he just does it's slapstick for a reason, you know. So you get both. You get everything.
Well, on that note, if we can have both, Brad, I think this is a good segue into our final segment of the day, which we call Let's Make It a Double.
We're near the end of the episode, so thanks for listening to the Film and Whiskey Show. Let's pair another film with this one, even if it's a struggle. It's our final segment of the day, now let's make it a double.
Let's Make It a Double is the part of the show where we pair this movie up with another film to make the perfect double feature. We were kind of walking Marya through the outline of our show before we hit record, and she said, I've already got something for that segment. So I want to turn the floor over to you, Marya. What is your let's make it a double film?
So I'm actually torn between two films. So I want to proposition two separate double features.
No, let's do
double
it.
feature number one, if you want to stay in the silent era. Double feature number one is 1928's Lonesome, which is also a Criterion film, so it's easy to get on Blu-ray. And it's about this couple played by Barbara Kent and Glenn Tyrod who meet at Coney Island, and they fall in love all in a whirlwind 24 hours. And it's all about modern life and the isolation of city living and what it is to connect with somebody and the magic that it to be in a city of millions of people and find your person. And it's another short one. I feel like it's like 70-something minutes, 75 minutes, 69 minutes. I don't know. There's two different things. It has some sync sound in it as well. It's just beautiful, and I think pairs nicely with the romantic comedy side of City Lights. But on double feature number two, if you want melancholy, Nights of Cabiria, the Fellini film, starring his wife, Juliana Messina, who was often referred to as the female Chaplin for her expressive face. And specifically the, how it keeps getting worse and worse and worse for the tramp in City Lights. Cabiria goes through a lot of trials and tribulations, and things get really bad. And she's just too trusting, and don't be trusting in this world. It is not a world for innocence. But by the end, again, it leaves you with some hope, and it leaves you, she's at her lowest point. I don't want to spoil why, but she's in this really the worst possible place you could possibly be as a single woman alone in the world. And it ends with this beautiful smile. It's very similar to the way City Lights ends. And you realize that, she's still got her, her coat on her back, and she's got her smile, and she's got her feet. Things are looking up. And so there are these two movies that are for people who are like, everything's terrible, but at least I'm alive. So that's that double feature.
I love that. All right, Brad, you have just seen your first silent movie ever. What would you pair it up with?
All right, this is going to be nowhere near what has just been offered. I think I might give two double features as well. The first one is going to be Some Like It Hot. I just think that Wilder has so much philosophically in common with Chaplin. And I think that there's so much going on there that just feels like it would vibe together, that I think those two movies together would be a great double feature.
If I may, I think it was Joshua Logan, the director Joshua Logan, said of Marilyn Monroe that she was the only other film actor who could simultaneously hold melancholy and comedy with just her face in the exact same way as Chaplin. He referenced Chaplin when talking about her as an actor. So I think that's actually a brilliant double.
Man, well, I should probably just leave it there. But I want to shout out a movie that I loved to watch as a child. And I think that there's this movie might be the cheaper form of Chaplin comedy, and I'm okay with that. I'm going to recommend The Time of Their Lives with Bud Abbott and Lou Costello. Because I loved that movie growing up. And I think that at the very least, some of the physical comedy that you get from Abbott and Costello can kind of mimic the older style. And I loved that film. So I'm going to put that one up there as well.
Brad, I'm going to bring this into the modern era. And when I was watching City Lights this time, one thing that I really want to call attention to, and I hope people go watch this as their first silent movie, because like I said, the influence of this movie is felt even today. And I most especially noticed it in this little scene where the eccentric millionaire is hosting a party for Charlie Chaplin after he finds him out on the street the second time he gets drunk. And he has all his friends over, and somebody puts a whistle in Charlie Chaplin's mouth. And Charlie Chaplin gets slapped on the back and then swallows the whistle. And there's this extended gag where there's an opera singer that's going to perform a little song, an aria or something in the room. And Chaplin starts coughing, and every time he coughs, it makes a whistle sound. And he interrupts it, and they all look at him, and then he stops, and then they get ready to start again, and then the whistle starts again. And it happens like 3 or 4 times. And the sheer comic timing of that moment, I was like, oh my gosh, I have seen this kind of moment replicated for decades and decades and decades. And in the spirit of bodily fluids on screen, it reminded me of this moment in the first Austin Powers International Man of Mystery.
Yes.
When right after Austin Powers gets de-thawed, he has to pee. And this pee goes on for like 45 seconds. And then every single time you think the scene is going to go on, there's just a slight little dribble more of pee. And it is, Charlie Chaplin himself would be proud. And like, honestly, the more I thought about it, the more I realized Mike Myers really, really leaned heavily on Chaplin in those movies. And the way that, the physicality of it, but also just the comic timing of those scenes. I just, I can never recommend Austin Powers highly enough. So that's my let's make it a double.
That's fantastic.
Bob, I've never seen an Austin Powers film.
What?
But Brad, you've seen a Chaplin film. How have you never seen Austin Powers? Come on.
Hey, I'm a man of culture. What can I say?
All right, guys, it is time for us to give final scores on this movie. I will get mine out of the way right now. Brad, this is probably one of my top 20 or 25 movies of all time. It is a 10 out of 10. The end.
Bob, I am going to let Marya go first.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also a 10 out of 10. I think it's a perfect movie. I don't know.
So here's my caveat. I will come back and score this another day. I'll score it today, but I'm going to come back, watch the movie again at some point once I've watched more silent film. I trust your guys' opinion, having seen, I don't know, 1 billion silent films at this point between the two of you. I just haven't seen other silent films, and I don't know how to gauge this against other movies that I've watched, because every single other film I've watched has had sound attached to it. So I'm going to go ahead and give this an 8.5 out of 10. And that's just based purely on
your love of Fellini. No.
Say it again.
Your love of Fellini.
My deep and adoring love of Federico Fellini. Yes, obviously. That's just based on my enjoyment. It was hilariously funny. I really enjoyed it. One of the better comedies I've watched. I think that I could probably come back and give this a 9.5 at some point, but for today, I'm going to sit at an 8.5.
All right, there you have it. Between Brad and I, we are at a 9.25 out of 10. Now, I do not expect that a lot of Film and Whiskey Nation has seen this movie, but if you have, I would like to know what you think. If we have inspired you to go watch your first silent movie, once again, a plug for the fact that it is 82 minutes long, and it is currently streaming on HBO Max, or Max as it has rebranded to now.
And you can watch it with your 8, 9, 10-year-old. Yeah. Totally fine.
As long as you can get over a couple suicide jokes, you should be good. But we're at a 9.25. Let us know what you think. You can find us on our social medias, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at Film Whiskey.
Or you can jump onto our Discord. We are on there every single day talking to you guys, the fans of the Film and Whiskey podcast. So please join the conversation. You can find a link to our Discord at the end of every single one of our show notes.
We want to thank our guest again today, Marya Gates. Marya, I'm going to turn the floor over to you. Is there anything you'd like to plug, and where can we find you?
Sure. I guess I would plug my Substack. We're like in the 2010s again, where newsletters are the new blog, which are the new Twitter. But it's oldfilmsflicker.substack.com. Every Friday, I write a feature called Directed by Women Viewing Guide, where I recommend 7 films directed by women to watch so you have a film a day for the whole next week. Usually it's 1 or 2 new releases and then 5 to 6 streaming picks. I just recently hit over 500 films recommended.
Wow.
So there are lots of films directed by women. And occasionally I will talk about silent films on that as well. But on the Substack itself, that's where I tend to do my writing about silent film. Because believe it or not, people do not pay that much. Although coming out of Babylon, I did get several pieces out of that. And then strangely, Harold Lloyd's Safety Last hit 100 years last month. And someone paid me to write about that. And I was like, everything's coming up, Marya. So if you are a listener who does have money and wants writing about silent film, please contact me. But otherwise, I write on the Substack. I just launched a feature called Your Silent Face, which is a New Order song that I love, but where I write about, I've only done one so far. It was Mary Astor. But mostly I write about, or plan to write about, silent film actors who transitioned successfully and are maybe more known for their acting in talkies. So, for example, Mary Astor is probably best known for Maltese Falcon, among other 1940s films. But she was one of the actresses to sort of come out of the late era of the silent film, and that's how she started. And she's got the most expressive eyes. And there's a lot of actresses like that, like Norma Shearer, who was the queen of MGM. I'm going to write one about her at some point, just to get people sort of thinking about these stars that maybe they think of in one mode and are afraid to go back and look at the silence.
Yeah.
And try to get people interested. Joan Crawford's another one I'm going to write about at some point. So I want to sort of highlight some of those actors that were able to transition, but now their silent films are sort of the ones that people take for granted.
I just keep hearing like crossover with Film and Whiskey episodes. Like, I will talk about Mary Astor all day because
Mary Astor's amazing. She's got a crazy personal life too.
I sat Brad down and just told, like, I made Brad watch Meet Me in St. Louis because it's maybe my favorite movie of all time. And I was like Mary Astor in the scene where they sing the song "You and I" is like one of the best pieces of acting I've ever seen in my life. You know,
and you know why she's so good?
Why is that?
Because she started acting in the silent era.
They had faces then,
they
right?
had faces then. That's why she's so good.
Brad, before we get out of here, I want to do one thing that we've never done on the History of Film and Whiskey podcast.
Oh, my goodness.
My favorite Charlie Chaplin movie is on the docket for next week, and that is Modern Times. It's a film that goes back and forth with City Lights as, Chaplin's greatest. Do you want to do it next week? Or do you want to do the two other Chaplin films first and do that one last? Would it be better for you to do them head to head or to get more Chaplin context and then do that one at the end of the series?
Man, I just want to savor this moment of Bob giving me choice. Like that has happened for 15 of our, 202 movies?
Yeah,
where
pretty
I
much.
actually had a say in what was happening. Bob, I think that we should just forget Chaplin for a few movies and go into I don't know, Marya can guide us.
Yeah.
Who's to say? No,
She watched Max Linder.
Yeah, there you go.
Max Linder. Let's throw him in there. No, I think we should do the other two films first.
Okay.
I'd like a little more time before to, get my feet wet before I jump into Modern Times.
Well, then what we're going to do is we're going to throw it back a few years from this, and we're going to look at 1925's The Gold Rush next week. So we'll be watching The Gold Rush. We're calling an audible on Film and Whiskey for the first time in history. Thank you for that, Brad. And thank you once again to our guest, Marya Gates. We will see you next week for The Gold Rush. But until then, I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And we'll see you next time.